Drama, power, betrayal. The courtroom battle has just taken a turn no one expected.
When legal claims involving Blake Lively and Justin Baldoni became public, they were initially understood through summaries, headlines, and second-hand descriptions. But as original materials were unsealed, including voice memos, videos, emails, script drafts, and court exhibits, the story began to change in more concrete ways. What mattered wasn't just what was alleged, but how those claims aligned, or failed to align, with the underlying record once voice memos and videos became available. Materials that had previously been referenced indirectly were now accessible in full, allowing the sequence to be examined rather than inferred. As these unsealed materials surfaced, including audio recordings, behind-the-scenes footage, and multiple script drafts, questions emerged about timing, consistency, and context. Claims that appeared straightforward when described in isolation began to look different when reviewed alongside contemporaneous emails, production decisions, and on-set communication. Court filings and declarations added another layer. When exhibits were read together rather than selectively, patterns became easier to identify. Some assertions depended on interpretation, others relied on partial context, and several became difficult to reconcile once the full record was considered. This video walks through that process step by step, not to assign motive or intent, but to compare specific claims against specific evidence, including voice memos, videos, scripts, and filings, and to explain why those materials reshaped how the claims were evaluated. Because when documentation becomes public, the issue isn't how a story sounds, it's whether the sequence holds up once the record is complete. Before any voice memos or videos were unsealed, the public understanding of the dispute between Blake Lively and Justin Baldoni was shaped largely by summaries. Claims were introduced through filings, media reporting, and selective descriptions of events rather than direct access to original materials. At that stage, the narrative relied heavily on interpretation. Statements about on-set conduct, script changes, and communication were presented without the full supporting context. Without access to audio recordings, behind-the-scenes footage, or complete script drafts, those claims were difficult to independently assess. This matters because early framing often sets expectations. Once a version of events is accepted publicly, later information is measured against that baseline. In this case, early descriptions of the dispute shaped how people initially understood Blake Lively's claims and Justin Baldoni's responses, even though the underlying materials were not yet available. Court filings referenced evidence that had not been released. Mentions of voice memos, internal emails, and production materials appeared in declarations, but audiences could not hear or see them directly. As a result, the discussion focused more on what the materials were said to show rather than what they actually contained. Media coverage reflected that limitation. Articles summarized positions instead of examining documentation. Without access to the full record, reporting emphasized allegation over comparison. This allowed the claims to stand largely uncontested in public discussion during the early phase. It's important to note that this does not mean the claims were accepted as fact, only that they were framed without contradiction. When original materials are unavailable, narratives tend to stabilize around the first complete version presented. In this case, that version centered on Blake Lively's account, with Justin Baldoni's position evaluated primarily through response rather than evidence. That balance began to shift only once materials started to become unsealed. Until then, the conversation operated in an informational vacuum, where interpretation filled gaps that documentation had not yet closed. This early phase explains why the later release of voice memos, videos, and court exhibits had such an impact. They didn't just add detail, they replaced assumption with sequence, allowing claims to be evaluated against the record itself. Once the voice memos and videos were unsealed, the discussion moved from description to comparison. For the first time, claims could be evaluated against original materials rather than summaries. That shift alone altered how several assertions were understood. The audio recordings provided a clearer sense of tone, timing, and context. Statements that had previously been characterized in filings or reporting could now be heard directly. This mattered because tone and sequence often change meaning. What can appear definitive in writing can sound more conditional or situational when heard in full. The same was true for the videos and behind-the-scenes footage. Visual context clarified how interactions unfolded on set and how conversations aligned with production decisions. Rather than relying on recollection, viewers could see how moments actually occurred and how they fit into the broader timeline. As these materials were reviewed, attention turned back to Blake Lively's claims and how they aligned with what the recordings showed. In several instances, the voice memos and videos complicated earlier interpretations by introducing context that had not been visible before. Claims that depended on emphasis or omission became harder to sustain once the full exchanges were available. This also affected how Justin Baldoni's position was assessed. With original materials accessible, responses could be evaluated alongside the same evidence, rather than in isolation. The comparison shifted from competing narratives to competing interpretations of the same record. Court filings referencing these materials took on new weight. Mentions of evidence were no longer abstract. Court exhibits could now be examined directly, allowing observers to track how specific claims related to specific documents, recordings, or footage. What's important is that this didn't require proving intent or motive. The change came from alignment. When claims were placed next to voice memos, videos, and audio recordings, discrepancies became easier to identify. Some assertions fit the record cleanly. Others depended on a narrower reading that became harder to maintain once the materials were viewed in full. This stage marked a turning point. The conversation was no longer about what the materials might show, it became about what they actually showed and how that evidence reshaped the credibility of the claims built around them. As attention moved beyond recordings and footage, another set of materials became central to evaluating the claims: the script drafts themselves. Once multiple versions were reviewed together, questions of timing and sequence became unavoidable. Earlier descriptions had framed script changes as abrupt or unilateral, but when script drafts were placed side by side, a clearer progression emerged. Revisions appeared incremental rather than sudden, and changes could be tracked across versions rather than attributed to a single moment. This mattered because several claims relied on the idea that decisions happened without discussion or consent. The timeline told a more complex story. Drafts circulated over time, often accompanied by emails and production notes that showed ongoing discussion. When these materials were aligned chronologically, the narrative of surprise or reversal became harder to maintain. This is where contradictions began to surface more clearly. Certain claims depended on isolating one draft or one moment, but when the full sequence of script drafts was reviewed, those moments appeared as part of a longer process rather than an exception. The documentation didn't erase disagreement, it contextualized it. These materials also affected how Blake Lively's claims were evaluated. Assertions about when changes occurred and how they were introduced were now testable against dated drafts and correspondence. In several instances, the timeline suggested overlap rather than conflict, complicating earlier interpretations. At the same time, Justin Baldoni's position could be assessed against the same record. With drafts and communications visible, responses could be compared directly to documented steps rather than inferred intent.
That comparison shifted the discussion away from motive and toward sequence. Court filings that referenced script issues gained new clarity once the drafts were visible. Mentions of court exhibits and supporting documentation could now be cross-checked against the actual materials, rather than summaries. This reduced ambiguity and narrowed the range of plausible interpretations. What emerged from this review wasn't a single decisive contradiction, but a pattern. Claims that depended on compressed timelines or selective framing became harder to reconcile once the drafts were read together. The record didn't speak loudly, it spoke consistently. And consistency matters. When claims and documentation align, disputes tend to narrow. When they don't, the gaps become more visible. In this case, the script drafts, viewed in sequence, raised questions that earlier descriptions had not fully addressed.
As the focus shifted from drafts and recordings to formal legal documents, court filings and declarations became central to how the claims were defended. These filings summarized events, described interactions, and characterized evidence in ways meant to support specific conclusions. But once underlying materials were unsealed, those summaries could be compared directly to the record. Declarations often relied on selective framing. References to voice memos, videos, and emails appeared in filings, but without the full context attached. When those same materials became accessible, the language used in the filings could be evaluated against what was actually documented. This comparison mattered because legal claims depend on accuracy and completeness. In several instances, the court filings emphasized particular moments while minimizing others. That approach can shape interpretation early, but it becomes vulnerable once court exhibits are reviewed in full. As observers examined the filings alongside the unsealed materials, discrepancies became harder to ignore. Descriptions that suggested clarity or certainty were complicated by additional context found in audio recordings, behind-the-scenes footage, and dated communications. The issue wasn't fabrication, it was compression. Complex sequences had been condensed in ways that favored one interpretation. This directly affected how Blake Lively's claims were assessed. Assertions that relied on narrow readings of events struggled to hold once the broader record was considered. When filings described intent or outcome, the supporting materials often showed a more layered process. At the same time, Justin Baldoni's position could be reassessed under the same standard. With filings no longer operating in isolation, responses could be measured against the same evidence cited in declarations. That parity shifted the discussion away from narrative advantage and toward consistency. What became clear is that filings are only as strong as the materials beneath them. When court exhibits are unavailable, summaries can dominate understanding. When those exhibits are visible, the balance shifts. This phase marked another turning point. The conversation was no longer about whether claims had been formally made, but whether the documentation supporting them aligned with the way they were presented. Once that question entered the discussion, the strength of the claims depended less on language and more on the record itself. As the unsealed materials were reviewed, attention expanded beyond recordings and filings to include testimony and third-party accounts that helped contextualize what the documentation showed. At this stage, credibility was no longer shaped by claims alone, but by how consistently those claims aligned with corroborating accounts. One of the names that entered this phase of the discussion was Mr. Clark. His involvement mattered, not because it introduced new allegations, but because it provided an additional reference point within the existing record. Mentions of Mr. Clark appeared alongside emails, timelines, and production-related communication, allowing observers to compare individual claims against broader recollections. This is where alignment became critical. When third-party accounts are consistent with voice memos, videos, and script drafts, they tend to reinforce credibility. When they diverge,
they raise questions about emphasis and framing. In this case, Mr. Clark's account was examined in relation to dated materials rather than in isolation. That comparison affected how Blake Lively's claims were weighed. Assertions about how certain interactions unfolded could now be measured not only against recordings and drafts, but against contemporaneous accounts from others present during those periods. This added another layer of verification to the timeline. The same applied to Justin Baldoni's position. With multiple sources available, responses were no longer evaluated against a single narrative, but against a converging set of references. Consistency across documentation, testimony, and court exhibits became the standard by which credibility was assessed. Court filings that referenced these accounts took on a different character once the materials were visible. Mentions of evidence involving third parties could now be cross-checked against the broader record, reducing reliance on interpretation alone. What emerged from this phase wasn't a dramatic contradiction, but a narrowing of plausible explanations. When recordings, drafts, filings, and third-party accounts point in the same direction, the space for reinterpretation shrinks. That process doesn't depend on accusation, it depends on alignment. By this point, the evaluation of claims had moved beyond competing statements. It centered on whether the total record, including Mr. Clark's account, supported the way those claims had been presented. And once that standard was applied consistently, credibility became less about persuasion and more about coherence.
By this stage, the focus shifted away from individual materials and toward how everything fit together over time. Once voice memos, videos, script drafts, emails, court filings, and third-party accounts were placed on a single timeline, the structure of the dispute became clearer. This mattered because several of Blake Lively's claims relied on compressed or selective sequencing. When events were described without full dates or context, interpretation filled the gaps. But when the materials were reviewed chronologically, those gaps narrowed. The timeline showed overlap where separation had been implied. Drafts circulated while conversations were ongoing. Audio recordings captured discussions that occurred before certain decisions were finalized. Behind-the-scenes footage aligned with moments that filings had described differently. Together, these materials created continuity rather than rupture. This is where contradictions became harder to reconcile. Claims that depended on isolated moments struggled once placed next to surrounding documentation. The issue wasn't that disagreements didn't exist, it was that the order of events didn't support the framing that had been presented earlier. For Justin Baldoni, this chronological review mattered as well. His responses could now be evaluated against the same timeline rather than against summaries. When communications, drafts, and recordings were aligned, positions that had seemed reactive appeared more consistent with the documented sequence. Third-party references, including Mr. Clark, reinforced this effect. His account didn't introduce new events, but it helped anchor timing. When testimony aligns with dated materials, it strengthens the reliability of the sequence itself. Court filings referencing these events also changed in weight once timing was clarified. Court exhibits that had seemed ambiguous gained definition when viewed alongside the full timeline. What once looked uncertain became more precise when placed in order. At this point, the evaluation of claims shifted decisively. The question was no longer whose version sounded more compelling, but whether the sequence held together under review. And once the timeline was established, certain interpretations became increasingly difficult to maintain. This phase didn't resolve every dispute, but it narrowed them. When documentation, testimony, and timing converge, the range of plausible explanations contracts. That convergence, more than any single memo or video, is what ultimately reshaped how the claims were understood. By the time all materials were available together, the discussion shifted again. The issue was no longer whether individual pieces of evidence existed, but how they worked collectively. Once voice memos, videos, script drafts, emails, court filings, and testimony were reviewed as a single record, the strength of certain claims became harder to sustain. This mattered most for how Blake Lively's claims were evaluated. Assertions that relied on selective emphasis struggled once the surrounding context was restored. When recordings were heard in full, drafts were read sequentially, and correspondence was placed on the timeline, several claims appeared narrower than originally framed. The weakening didn't come from contradiction alone, it came from comparison. When multiple sources describe the same period differently, the version that aligns most consistently with documentation tends to carry more weight. In this case, the convergence of materials limited how broadly some claims could be interpreted. For Justin Baldoni, this same process reshaped how his position was understood. With access to the complete record, responses could be assessed against the same materials rather than against summaries. Consistency across documentation, audio recordings, and third-party accounts, including Mr. Clark, reduced reliance on inference. Court-related materials reflected this shift as well. Court exhibits that once appeared supportive of certain assertions looked more conditional when examined alongside the rest of the record. Court filings that summarized events lost persuasive force when their characterizations could be tested directly against source materials. This phase didn't require assigning intent. The claims weakened because the record became less ambiguous. Where earlier interpretations had depended on gaps, those gaps were now filled by overlapping sources. And when gaps close, narratives tend to narrow. Public discussion followed suit. As the materials circulated, analysis moved away from headline conclusions and toward documentation. The conversation became less about which side sounded more credible and more about which interpretation fit the record without strain. By this point, the outcome wasn't driven by reaction or persuasion, it was driven by coherence. Once the full record was considered, the space for expansive claims contracted, not because of argument, but because of alignment. When the full set of materials was examined together, the picture that emerged was less dramatic than early characterizations suggested, but more definitive. The unsealing of voice memos, videos, script drafts, emails, court filings, and court exhibits didn't introduce a new story, it clarified the one that had already been forming beneath the surface. For Blake Lively, this meant that several claims depended on interpretation that narrowed once documentation was complete. When events were viewed in sequence, the margin for expansive readings contracted. Assertions that had appeared strong in isolation became more conditional when placed alongside the full record. The same review affected how Justin Baldoni's position was understood. With access to the same materials, responses could be evaluated against evidence rather than inference. The comparison didn't eliminate disagreement, but it grounded it in documentation rather than description. Third-party context reinforced this outcome. Mr. Clark's account, when aligned with dated materials, supported the overall timeline rather than challenging it. His involvement didn't introduce new claims, but it added stability to the sequence once testimony and documentation were read together. What ultimately mattered wasn't a single memo or recording, it was convergence. When audio recordings, behind-the-scenes footage, and written communication all pointed in the same direction, interpretation narrowed naturally. The record didn't argue, it accumulated. Court materials reflected this shift. Court filings that had once framed events broadly became less persuasive when their summaries could be checked against source material. Court exhibits, viewed in full, reduced reliance on characterization and increased reliance on chronology. By the end of this process, the role of the unsealed materials was clear. They didn't escalate the dispute, they resolved ambiguity. Once that ambiguity was reduced, certain claims weakened not because they were disproven outright, but because they no longer fit the complete sequence. This is how documentation changes outcomes, not through reaction, but through alignment. When evidence is accessible, the story isn't decided by tone or emphasis. It's decided by whether the timeline holds together once everything is visible. When everything is placed back in order, the outcome looks less like a dramatic reversal and more like a narrowing of interpretation. The unsealing of voice memos, videos, script drafts, emails, and court exhibits didn't create a new version of events. It clarified the one that had already been developing beneath summaries and characterizations. For Blake Lively, the effect was structural. Claims that relied on selective framing weakened once the full documentation was available. When the timeline was restored and materials were reviewed together, interpretation had less room to expand. What remained was a record that constrained how broadly certain assertions could be read. The same process reshaped how Justin Baldoni's position was understood. With access to the same evidence, responses could be evaluated against original materials rather than descriptions. That parity shifted the discussion away from narrative advantage and toward alignment with the record itself. Third-party context reinforced that alignment. Mr. Clark's account did not introduce new claims, but it helped anchor timing. When testimony, recordings, and dated communication converged, the sequence became harder to dispute without straining the record. Legal materials reflected this shift as well. Court filings that once summarized events broadly became less persuasive once court exhibits were reviewed directly. The strength of any claim ultimately depended not on emphasis, but on whether it held up once all supporting materials were visible. What this sequence shows is how unsealed materials change outcomes quietly. They don't argue, they accumulate. And when enough sources point in the same direction, audio recordings, behind-the-scenes footage, written communication, and third-party accounts, ambiguity contracts on its own. In the end, the most important change wasn't emotional or rhetorical, it was procedural. Once the record became complete, the claims could only stand if they fit the sequence as a whole, and when they didn't, their force diminished, not because of reaction, but because the timeline no longer supported them. If careful, evidence-first breakdowns like this are useful to you, subscribing helps keep this channel focused on explanation rather than reaction, and ensures these longer, quieter stories continue to be told with clarity.